In this beginner tutorial, I'm going to show you the basics of animation in Blender. So I'm going to go over all of the basic things that you need to know to get started with animation in Blender. So I'll be going over things like the timeline, adding keyframes, and using the graph editor to edit your animations. And then at the end of this tutorial, I will show you how to animate the cube. So we're going to add some life to the cube and kind of make it look like it's jumping and kind of looking around, and we'll be creating this animation right here. Now, if you want to learn the basics of animation in Blender, then I would recommend watching the entire tutorial, but I will also have timestamps in the video description if you'd like to hop to a certain part of this video. And I will also have a free download of the project files for this tutorial on my Gumroad store and my Patreon, links in the description if you want to check that out. And I am trying to make Blender tutorials and Blender content for a living, so if you'd like to help support me and my YouTube channel, then some great places to help support me are on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. So on my Gumroad store and Patreon page, you can get 3D models and assets, you can get the tutorial files and artwork project files, and you can also get procedural materials and some exclusive tutorials as well. So when you're doing animation, you need to add keyframes, and those keyframes are going to tell Blender what is going to be animated and where it's going to be animated. So you're going to be adding keyframes at different time points in Blender. So right down here under Blender's 3D viewport, we have this right here, and this is the timeline. And so in the timeline, you're going to be adding different keyframes, and you're going to be adding those keyframes to bones or objects or values. And then you'll move to a further place in time in the timeline, and then you'll add another keyframe, and so that's going to tell Blender to go from one keyframe to the next keyframe. So let's start by adding some basic keyframes. Now I need to delete the default cube because that's what we always do, so I'm just going to double tap the A key and we'll press X to delete, and I'm going to delete everything. So I'll now press Shift A, and I'm going to be adding a cube because, you know, you can't use the default cube, you have to always add a new one. Alright, so let's just do some very basic animation to this cube. So I'm going to select the cube, and then I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to scrub this blue line here on the timeline, and I'm going to bring it all the way back to frame 1 so we can start doing the animation. Alright, so we are now at frame 1 and the cube is right here, and so I want to add a keyframe to tell it that that's where the cube is going to start. So to add keyframes, you are going to press the I button. So make sure your mouse is hovered in the 3D space and then press I, and I is the shortcut key to inset a keyframe. Now you do have a bunch of different options here, and so this is asking you what values you want to add keyframes onto. And when you're animating objects in the 3D space, there are three main values that you're going to use: the location, the rotation, and the scale. So if you press G to grab, that is going to change the location. If you press R to rotate, that'll change the rotation. And then if you press S, that is going to change the scale. So when you press I, it's going to ask you what values you want to add keyframes onto. Now, if you want to add a keyframe that's going to affect all three of those values, you can just click on this one right here, which is location, rotation, and scale. So after you press the I key, you can just click on any of these ones. I'm going to do the location, rotation, and scale. Now, when I do that, you can see that right down here on the timeline, we have this little yellow diamond. And so that is Blender telling us that we have a keyframe on that part of the timeline. And also, if you press the A key to deselect the cube, you can see that now the diamond is gone. And so in the timeline, you're only going to be able to see the keyframes with the object that's selected. So if I now select this object again, then there is the diamond. And also in the timeline, if you press the A key, just like selecting and deselecting objects, if you press A in the timeline, that is going to select and deselect the keyframes. So we have now inserted a keyframe right here. So I'm just going to move over to frame 100. So you can just scrub with the timeline, just click and drag and move over to frame 100, and I now just want to transform the cube. So I can just press G to grab, and I'll also rotate it, so I'll press R to rotate it, and if you wanted to, you could also press S to scale and just scale that up. Now, if we move our timeline, or if we play the timeline, it's not going to keep this, and that's because we haven't added a keyframe on this value. So if I move this, you can see it's going to hop back to the original value, so I just need to do this again, so I'm going to bring it over, I'll rotate it, and then I'll also scale it. So we now need to add a keyframe right here to tell Blender that that's where we want the next keyframe to be on frame 100. So again, I'm going to press I, and I'm going to click on location, rotation, and scale. So now that I've done that, if I scrub through the timeline, you can see it's going from the first keyframe to the second keyframe. Now I'm just going to press Ctrl Z to undo that, and if I press I again to add a keyframe, this time I could just click on rotation. And you can see now that I did that, it's moving the location, but because I didn't add this keyframe for the rotation and the scale as well, it's it's only going to add a keyframe to the location. And so the rotation and scale aren't going to be changed. Now, to be able to visualize this a little bit better, if I press the N key, that is going to open up this side panel, and I'm going to go right down here to Item. And you can see right here on Item, we now have this Transform tab right here. So this is showing us the transform values for this object. So as I talked about earlier, we have 3 different transform values. We have the location, and that is going to be moving it around. We have the rotation to rotate it, and then we have the scale to scale it up or down. And each of these transform values have 3 values within them because we have the X and the Y and the Z axes. So those are all the axes in the 3D space. So I'm just going to press Ctrl Z to undo that a few times, and then I now want to add a keyframe, but this one I want to affect the location, rotation, and scale. So I'll press I again, and then I'm going to click on location, rotation, and scale. And now it's done it for all the values. So now if I click and drag to scrub the timeline, you can see it is rotating and scaling the cube as well. Now you may have noticed something, and that is that these values right here have different colors. So if there are no keyframes on these values, they're just going to be the default gray. So you can see all these different values here in Blender, they're just normally the default gray color. If there is animation on those values, then they are going to be green. So green is basically telling you that there is animation on that value, but there isn't a keyframe on that exact frame. If I move over to frame 100 where there is a keyframe, they're going to turn yellow, and that is Blender telling you that there is a keyframe right at that part in time. So you can animate the cube in the 3D space, but you can also animate these values. So let's say I want to go over to maybe 150, and then I want to change the location and rotation. So what I can do is I can click and drag, and I can drag these values. So let's just move the cube over, and then also maybe I want to rotate the cube, so we're going to rotate that over. So now what I can do is I can just add keyframes to these values because these are the only ones that are changed. So to add keyframes to these values, I could press I and then insert a location and rotation and scale, or in this case just a location and rotation because I didn't actually change the scale. But instead what I can do is I can just hover my mouse over the values, and then I can press I, and that is going to add a keyframe to these values. So I can hover my mouse over this value and press I, that is going to add a keyframe to the values. And I can also just right click, and I can right click on these values, and then you can see I can add a keyframe, or in this case I can replace the keyframe because I already have a keyframe at that value. And now if you scrub through the timeline, you can see that it moves up here, and then we have the other keyframes, and so the cubes moves over. And I will go over this later on in this tutorial, but you can animate pretty much any value in Blender. So just like we animated these, you can animate pretty much any value in Blender, all these different values in Blender, but I'll go over that in a moment. So I'm going to press the N key now to close that side panel. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about how to use the timeline. So if you just click and drag right up here on these numbers, then that is going to move the timeline around. Now, if you want to play the timeline, you can click on the play button right here, and that is going to play the timeline. And then you can see there is also a pause button. So you can click on that pause button to pause the timeline. And then there also is a play backwards. So you can click on that button, and that is going to play the animation backwards. And you may also see me just clicking and dragging right down here. That is because I'm using the right click select, so I can click and drag right down here. But for most of you who are using the left click select, you'll just click and drag right up here on the numbers. Now, there also are some other buttons right here. So these buttons jump to the next keyframe. So if you click on that, it's going to jump to the next keyframe in the timeline. And you can also click on this button here, and that is going to jump back. Now, these buttons right here on the very outer edges, those are going to jump to the start frame and the end frame. So if you click on this, you can see it's going to go to frame 1. And if I click on this, it's going to go to frame 250. So depending on how long your animation is, you can change the start and end frame. So for instance, I could just have my animation end at frame 160, but you can see the default is 250. So if I just click on this end value right here, I can just type in 160 and then hit enter, and you can see now the end frame is going to move to here. Now another thing you can change is the frame rate. So if you click right over here on the output properties, let me just make this a little bit bigger, you can change the frame rate. So the frame rate is basically telling Blender how many frames are going to be within 1 second. So the FPS, that stands for frames per second. Now the default is 24 frames per second, and for most things 24 frames per second is going to be just fine for your animations. I am recording this video in 60 frames per second because I want it to be nice and smooth. I'm using OBS, my screen recording software, to record this, but for most animations and things, you're just going to use 24 24 frames per second. If you want it to be more smooth, you could turn it up. So for instance, I could turn it up to 60 and that's going to be a lot more smooth. So basically now if I play this, you can see it's much faster, but it's also much more smooth. So if I change this to 60 frames per second, there's now going to be 60 frames within every second. And you can see it's much more smooth now than 24 because there are more frames in every second. I'm just going to change this back to 24, which is the default. For most animations, usually animations are 24 frames per second. Now, if you've added some keyframes, but you want to edit those keyframes or change them, or maybe you want to change the timing, then you can do that. So let me first show you how to change the timing. So what you can actually do is you can actually just select the keyframe. You can press G to grab in the timeline, and that is going to move the keyframe. So if I wanted this to move up much quicker, I could press G to grab and then move over, and I could place it right here. And now if I play this, you can see it's going to move up much faster. And I can also just select this, press G to grab and bring it over, and that way it's going to move much faster. And then if you have a keyframe selected, you can press X to delete, and then you can just click on delete keyframes. You can also press the delete key, and then that's going to delete the keyframe. So I'll just delete that. So X to delete. And now if I move through this, you can see that because we deleted that keyframe in the middle, it's just going to go from this keyframe to that keyframe. Now let's say that I want the cube to pause in this location, and I just want to pause for a little while, and then we'll have another keyframe and have it move over. So what I would want to do is I would want to duplicate this keyframe so that it stays right where it is and it doesn't move. So you can just select the keyframe and then you can press Shift D. And so Shift D will duplicate the keyframe, just how Shift D will duplicate the object in the 3D space. You can press Shift D and that's going to duplicate the selected keyframe. Now I'm just going to delete this keyframe real quick, and I want to show you another way that you could do this. So you could just simply move over to frame 90 or wherever you want to move it to, and then you could press the I key again and you could insert location, rotation, and scale. And you can see now it's just going to stay where it is and it's not going to move. Now you can see that in between these two keyframes there is a little line here, and if you press A to select the keyframes, you can see that that line is orange. So this line here in between these keyframes is basically telling you that the keyframe is exactly the same, and so nothing's going to change. Because I didn't move the object, I just moved over here and then added another keyframe, and so these two keyframes are exactly the same, and so you can see that the cube is not moving. So now I'm going to move over to maybe frame 110, and I'll press G to grab, R to rotate, and S to scale. Kind of bring that over there, and then again I'll press I to insert a keyframe, and we want to do location, rotation, and scale. So now you can see that the cube moves, and then it just kind of stays and it pauses, and then it moves over. Now maybe I don't like where this cube is, and so I want to override the keyframe. So I don't want to delete the keyframe, I just want to move it and then replace a keyframe. So basically overlap a keyframe on top of this and replace it. So how you do this is you just change this to whatever you want. So I'm just going to like rotate the cube, move it over, and then just make sure that the timeline is on that keyframe. So it's exactly on that keyframe. I can now press I, and then we're going to insert location, rotation, and scale. And that is going to override the keyframe. So now we just have a new keyframe and it's been replaced. And also the orange line isn't there because these keyframes are both different. Now this workflow of manually adding keyframes by pressing I is a little bit slow. And so there's actually a much faster way to animate in Blender. And that is by using this button right here, the auto keying. So if you turn this button on, you can see now it's blue. And so when this is on, it's going to automatically add a keyframe whenever you transform an object. So let's just move over here. I'm just going to move over here, and then I can press R to rotate, just click to place that. And you can see that because the auto key was on, it automatically added a keyframe there. And I can also just edit this keyframe by maybe scaling it and moving it. And when you transform the object, you can see it's going to tell you that the auto keying is on. And so when I'm doing animation, I use this most of the time because it's much faster and it will just speed up your workflow quite a lot because you don't have to press I and then manually insert keyframes. Now I still use this some of the time if I want more manual control, and also I'll sometimes animate these values here if you press the N key, as I talked about earlier in this tutorial. But for most of my animation, I use the auto keying because I can just animate objects and it will automatically place a keyframe right there. Just make sure that you turn it off when you're done animating, because this still happens for me sometimes as well. I'll be animating with the auto key and then I'm finished animating, and so I'll start to go do some other stuff in Blender, kind of set up the scene, and then I'll realize that this entire time it was adding keyframes because the auto key was on. So just make sure you only turn this on right when you're going to start animating, and then once you're done, then just make sure you turn it off. Alright, so I've showed you the basics of animating objects in Blender, but there are so many other things you can animate in Blender, because as I talked about earlier in this tutorial, you can animate pretty much any value in Blender. So I'm just going to double tap the A key in the timeline to select all the keyframes, and then I will press X to delete, and I'm just going to delete the keyframes. I'm going to show show you just a few different things that you can animate. So let's first go to the shader nodes. So I'm going to click right over here on the shading tab and we can edit the shader nodes. So I'm now going to click on new here to add a new material, and let's just go into rendered mode. So I'll just press Z, move my mouse up to go into the rendered view. I'm going to press Shift A and I'm going to add a magic texture. You don't have to follow along with this if you don't want to, or you can do whatever you want. I'm just going to add a magic texture. I'll also press Shift A and I'm going to search here for an emission, and then I want to plug the emission up to the surface. And then I want to delete the principled, and then I'm going to take the color and put that into the color of the emission. So now you can see that we're previewing that magic texture. Now I want to be able to animate this, so I want to add a timeline down here. So I'm going to move my mouse right up here when the crosshair appears, and then I can click and drag down, and that is going to add a timeline. And then I'm also going to click right here when the crosshair appears here, click and drag out, and then let go, and that is going to bring that window out. Now right now it's the shader editor, so I want to click on this button right here, right next to my head. Click on this button and we're going to change this to the timeline. And so I'm going to start by going to frame 1, and then I want to add a keyframe on the scale value. So as I talked about earlier, you can right click and then just click on insert keyframe. That's going to insert a keyframe on that value, but you can also just hover your mouse over the value and press I, and that is going to insert a keyframe. So you can see right down here, we now have a keyframe on frame 1. Now you may notice something, and that is that there are 2 keyframes. And so this is Blender telling you that there is a keyframe on the cube, but there is also a keyframe on the material. So if you don't see this little thing right here, you can kind of click and drag to pull it out. It might be closed, but you can just click on that arrow and drag it out. And so this is basically going to tell you where there are keyframes on the different parts of the object. So we have one keyframe here because this is the keyframe on the cube, but then right down here, it's going to tell you that there's a keyframe for the material. And it's also going to show you the shader right here in the node tree because we added that keyframe within the materials here. Real quick, I'm just going to hop back over to the layout. If I click and drag and open this up, you can see that it's right here as well. So if I press I and we're going to insert a location, I can now move over here, press G to grab. We're just going to bring this over, and then I can press I again and we're going to insert a location. So I've now added just a simple animation of the cube moving. If I open this up, you can see that it's going to tell you what is actually animated. So we have the cube, and then we have the cube transforms, and you can click on this little arrow to open this up, and it's going to show which values are animated. So that's why there are sometimes multiple keyframes to tell you where they're animated. So let's go back over here to the shading tab, and let's now animate this. So I'm going to just move this over. I'm going to move it over to frame 41, and then I'm going to change the scale. So I'm going to make the scale much smaller, so I'll make it really small. All right, so I've set the scale value to a much smaller value. So I'm now going to hover my mouse over the value and I'll press I, and that is going to add a keyframe. And you can see that we have the material. So if I move this over, you can see here is the material. So here is the material values, and then here is the object ones. So if I select this and press G to grab, this is going to move around the object's location. And then if I click and select these ones and press G to grab, that is going to change the scale because we have 2 different values of keyframes. We have the magic texture scale and also the location. So it's going to show the multiple sets of keyframes. All right, so I can now just play through this and you can see that the scale is actually changing. So that is super cool. So almost every value in Blender can be animated. Pretty much all these values can be animated. The strength value and all of that. I'm also going to animate the distortion. So I'm going to go back to frame 1 and I can hover my mouse over this and press I to insert a keyframe there, and then I can move over here. Let's actually move to frame 50, and then I can just turn the distortion up, and then I will hover my mouse over this and press I again to add a keyframe there. So if I now play through this, you can see that that distortion value is being animated. And what's really cool about Blender's animation is that it can also animate colors as well. So I can just unplug this color here. I can unplug the magic texture from the emission, and then let's just select the magic texture, and I'll just press X to delete it to make it a bit more simple. So I'm just going to move to frame 1, and then on the color here, I can just make this like a blue color. So I'm going to move it over there to a blue color. And now that I've set that to a blue color, I can just hover my mouse over the value and press I, and that is going to insert a keyframe on that color value. And you can see it has the yellow there because there is a keyframe right on that exact spot. So I can now just move over here, move to the end, and you can see there is a green outline, and the green is telling you that there are keyframes on this value, but it's not on this exact time in the timeline. So now I can just click on this and I'll make it a red color, just like that. And then again, just hover your mouse over the color value and press I, and that is going to insert a keyframe. So if I now play through this, you can see it's actually animating that value. So it starts out as blue, and then it kind of gets purple and pink, and then it goes to red. Alright, so that is how you animate other values in Blender. I'm just going to hop back over to the layout now. So the timeline does have a lot of options that you can use to edit your keyframes, but if you want even more control over your keyframes and your animation, then you're going to want to use the graph editor in Blender. So the graph editor is a new window in Blender, so we need to open it up. So to open it up, I'm going to move my mouse right over here when the crosshair appears, and then I'm going to click and drag and split the window, and now we can just change this to the graph editor. So I'm going to click right up here to change the window type, and under animation we're going to change it to the graph editor. So the graph editor is a really great way to have more control over your keyframes. So just like down here in the timeline where you can see all the different keyframes, you also have that view right up here in the graph editor. So I'm just going to close this one, and we can work with this one up here in the graph editor. So it's going to show you the cube, and this is this object, this cube object right here, and then it's going to show you some different things like the material, and you can see that there's the different color values because we animated the color. If I go into the rendered view, you can see that we animated the color, so it's going to show the colors values right there. And if I open up the cube action, you can see that we have the cube transformation. So if you click on the arrow to open it up, we now have the X location, the Y location, and the Z location because I'm animating this cube to move over. Now, if you want to change the size of the graph editor, you can hold down the control key and then click and hold with your mouse wheel. So just control key and then click with your mouse wheel and hold it down, and you can change the size of the graph editor. So I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger, maybe just pull this out so we can see that a little bit better. Now right up here on the graph editor, the top row right here, that is going to be the timeline. So it's basically going to show you all the frames. So we have all the frames up here, and going back and forth, that's going to change the time. Now up and down, that is changing the actual values. So I'm just going to select these keyframes right here, and I'll press X to delete, and I want to delete the keyframes. So I'm now just going to move this over to a frame 100, and then I'm going to press G to grab, and let's bring this up on the Z axis. And I can also just like rotate this cube over, I'll rotate it over, and then I can press the I key to insert a keyframe, and I want to do the location, rotation, and scale. So now that I've done that, you can see that we have these keyframes down here, and then we also have these keyframes up here. So all of these little dots right here, those are all of the keyframes. Now, if you want to just edit a specific keyframe, like for instance, let's say I want to edit the location, I can just go right here, go over here to the side panel, and you can see that here is the Z location. So I can just click on that, and whenever you click on these values, it's going to highlight those keyframes. So I'm going to click on the Z location, and you can see that now it's highlighting that. So we have the first keyframe, which is right here, and then we have the second keyframe, which is right here, and you can also see those keyframes down here in the timeline. And so at frame 1, the cube starts down here, and then as we move it up, you can see that the cube is moving up. So again, going back and forth is going to change where it is in time, and then up and down, that is going to actually change the value. So you can see it starts at 0, and then it goes up here to about 5. So what's really cool about the graph editor is you can just select keyframes, and you can press G to grab, and you can move those keyframes around. So if you want to speed up or slow down the animation, you can press G to grab, and then you can click and hold with your mouse wheel and constrain it to the axis going back and forth. And I can just change that, and now you can see that that line there is taking longer to come up. So if I now play this by pressing the space bar to play, you can see that now it's coming up much slower, or I can also move it back, and you can see that now the cube is coming up much quicker. Now every keyframe has these things right here, and these are handles. Now in the timeline, you can't actually change the handles manually, and so that's why the graph editor is so useful, because you can click right here to change the handles. You can just click on these handles, and then you can press G to grab, and that is going to move the handle. Now the handles are going to change the shape of the animation. So you can see right here, if I just play this, you can see that the cube starts to speed up, and then as it gets towards the end, it starts to slow back down. But you can actually change the handles, and that is going to change the animation. So if I press G to grab and move this handle, you can see now it kind of gets faster, and then it kind of actually goes back down because I moved that up, and so it actually went up before going back down. Or for instance, if I wanted the cube to come up really fast and stop really quick, I could press G to grab, and I could move this handle down, and I could make it much sharper. So you can see now that is much sharper there, unlike this one where it slowly starts to get faster. This one stops immediately, and you can see that if I play that, the cube gets faster and faster, and then right there at the point of the next keyframe, it just stops instantly. So let me just show you an instance where this might be really useful. So I'm just going to delete the cube, and then I'm going to press Shift A, and I'm going to add a monkey head, and then let's also press Shift A, and I'm going to add a cube here, and I'm going to bring the cube over. So I'll just bring it over on the Y-axis like this, and then I'm also going to scale the cube cube up, and I'm going to scale it up on the z-axis, and then I'll also scale it up on the x-axis, just like that. All right, so I'm now going to have the monkey head slam into the wall. So I'm going to select the monkey head right there, and then I'm going to go over, just drag this over to frame 1. So I need to add a keyframe here to tell the monkey head that's where it's going to start. So I'm actually going to turn on the auto key, and that way it'll just automatically add keyframes. So I'm going to just turn on the auto key by clicking on that button. And then to add a keyframe here, I can just press the G key to grab, and then I can just click to place it right there. So I'm not going to move it at all. And you can see that it's added those keyframes right there. So now what I can do is I can move to, let's see here, how fast is this going? I'll move to frame 50. And then with the monkey head selected, I'm going to press G to grab, and I'm going to click and hold with my mouse wheel to constrain it to the y-axis, and I'm just going to stick it right there till it hits the wall, okay, just like that. And because we had the auto key turned on, the auto key feature, it automatically added a keyframe. So now if I go back here, I can play this, and you can see the monkey head just moves, but then it kind of slows down and stops right there at the wall. But let's say the monkey head is moving really fast, and I want it to look like it's slamming into the wall and then stopping really quickly. Well, that is where changing the handles could come into play. So you can see right here, here is the Y location. So what I'm going to do is just select this handle right here, and then I can press G to grab, and I can move this up and make it really sharp, just like we did earlier. So now if I play through this, you can see the monkey head moves faster and faster, and then it just slams into the wall there, that brick wall, and it stops moving. So this is just one very simple example of how the handles can be used to edit the animation. Now you can edit these handles manually, but there also are some handle presets. So if you press A to select everything, that's just going to select all the keyframes. You can also just select them here. And I want to change all of the handle types at once. So if you press the T key, make sure your mouse is either in the timeline or in the graph editor. If you press the T key, that is going to bring up the Keyframe Interpolation. And this is basically presets for the handle type. So there are a bunch here, and there are some different ones you could play around with. But right here, these are the most common 3 ones that you're going to use. So I'm going to click on the consistent one first, and this consistent one, there's not really going to be any smoothing. It's going to be very, very sharp. So you can see if I play through this, you can see up until the next keyframe, nothing is going to change. So it's going to stay at the exact same point. But then when we go to the second keyframe, it's going to automatically hop to the next keyframe. So that is the first one. That is the consistent one. Now, if you press T again, that is going to bring this up, and I'm going to go to the next one, which is linear. And this one here, this linear one, it's not going to have any smoothing. So it's not going to slowly speed up and then slowly stop. It's just going to go exactly from the first keyframe to the second keyframe. So it looks very robotic. You can just see that the monkey head moves over and then it just stops very quickly. So that is the second one, the linear one. Let's press the T key again. You can press the T key with your mouse over the timeline or over the graph editor. And I'm going to click on this one down here, this last one, which is BZA. So I'll click on the BZA, and this is the one that we were working with earlier. This is the default one in Blender. So you can see that it starts to slowly speed up. You can see right here on the monkey head, if I play this, it starts out very slow and then it slowly goes faster and faster. And then because we edited this, it's now going to be really sharp, but I could just bring this down and make it much more smooth. And now you can see that it starts to speed up, and then it's at the fastest point right here. It's going down those values on the time, and then it'll slow down and then slowly stop. So this is the most common one you're going to use, the BZA, because it makes your animations look very nice and smooth. Alright, so I'm now going to open up a new Blender file, and we're going to create this animation right here. I will walk you through the entire process. We're going to be creating this animation right here of this cube, and we're going to kind of give some life to the cube and make him look around and jumping around. So I'm going to just click on File, and I'm just going to click on New, and I'm just going to open up a new default Blender file. So just double tap the A key to select everything, and then I'll just press X to delete, and we are just going to delete everything. I'm now going to press Shift A, and we are going to add a cube. I'll press G to grab, and we are going to bring this up on the Z-axis, and I'm just going to stick this right here. So I'm now going to press Shift A, and I'm also going to add a plane, just a ground plane for our cube. Let's press S to scale, and we are going to scale this up just like that. And then I can also select this cube. I'll press G to grab. We're going to move it, and I'll just click with my mouse wheel, and I'm going to bring it right over here. So that is where the cube is going to start, and then we will animate the cube. And then in the animation, I also want the cube to like jump up on a platform. So I'm going to press Shift A, and let's add another cube, and I'll just like bring this cube over here. I can scale this one up, and then maybe also I'll scale it up on the y-axis like that, maybe bring it down a little bit, something like that. I'm also going to select the cube and I'm going to tab into edit mode, and I'm going to select everything, and I'll just press Ctrl B to add a bevel, and I'm just going to scroll my mouse wheel out so it has a lot of cuts. Click to place that. I can tab back into object mode, and then using the object context menu I can just shade that cube smooth. Alright, so I'm now ready to animate, so I'm going to select the cube. Let's make the timeline a little bit bigger. Alright, so with the cube selected, I'm going to click on this button to turn on the auto key, and so I first just want to place a keyframe right here. So I'm going to press G to grab and then just click to place it, and you can see it's added a keyframe right there. So I can now play the timeline by pressing the space bar, and I just want the cube to kind of stay where it is for just a short while. So I'm now going to press G to grab and then just click again to place another keyframe right there. Alright, so I am now going to press 1 on the numpad, and that is going to go to the side view. So I can go on to side view and just animate the cube jumping. So I'm just going to move over maybe about 5 frames, and then I can press G to grab and R to rotate. Let's just bring that over, and then let's move over another 5 frames or so, and then I'll press G to grab and R to rotate, and we're going to bring that right down there. So just put it right down there on the ground plane. Bring that down a little bit more. All right, so I can press 1 on the numpad again to go to the front view, and we can just see how that's looking. So there you go. You can see now the cube jumps. So if you want to edit anything, you can do that. So you can see that the cube goes way too far over and then just kind of goes much more straight down. So I'm going to go back to frame 25, and I'll press G to grab, and I'll move that back a little bit. And because we have the auto key on, it's automatically going to override the keyframe, and that is looking much better. And then also the cube would probably fall down a little bit faster. So I'm going to select this last keyframe down here, and I'll press G to grab, and I'm going to move it over so it falls a little bit faster. So it'll just come up and then come down just slightly faster, just by like 1 frame or so. So if we play that, that's looking pretty cool. The cube kind of jumps, but it doesn't look very realistic because the cube would probably slide a little bit on the ground. So I'm going to move over just a few frames, maybe to frame 35 or so, and then I'll press G to grab, and I'm going to bring this over on the x-axis. So now if I go back here and play this, you can see the cube jumps, and then the cube just slides a little bit. And I think I'll select this keyframe and move it over just a little. So now the cube jumps and then the cube slides. So that just makes it a little bit more realistic. It really adds a nice touch to the animation. All right, so now I want to duplicate this keyframe because I want the cube to just stay exactly where he is. So I'm going to press Shift D, bring the keyframe out, and just place it right there. So then it just stays where it is for just a moment. All right, so I now just want to move over, and I want to have the cube kind of look around. So I'm just going to move over to maybe frame 55. I can press R to rotate, and we're going to rotate this on the Z-axis and just rotate that over. So now the cube is kind of looking over. Maybe I'll move that a little bit farther to maybe frame 60. The cube kind of looks over. And then I want to duplicate this again and just have the cube stay where it is. So I'll press Shift D to duplicate. We're going to bring that over. So now the cube just kind of looks over, and he just stays right there. All right, now I want the cube to look over, kind of over to here. So I'll move over to maybe frame 85, and I can just rotate this again. So press R to rotate. I can rotate this over on the Z-axis and bring that over. And you can really see the power of the auto key because it's just adding keyframes, and so I don't have to manually add them. It's automatically adding them every time I move the cube. All right, that's good. So we now move that over. Now, if I press 1 to go to front view, the cube isn't going to move exactly forward or exactly sideways. He's going to move over like this. So what I'm going to do is press 5 on the numpad, and that is going to take me to the orthographic perspective. And that way we're not going to be able to see as much perspective, and it's going to be much more flat. And then I can also just move my view, and I'm going to move my view until I can see exactly the side of the cube, just like that. All right, now I want to select this keyframe again, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, maybe bring it over to frame 90. So now the cube kind of just stays where he is. Maybe move that over to maybe frame 95. Let's go right over here, and now I'm going to have the cube jump again over here. So I'll press G to grab, move it up, and R to rotate, just stick it up there. And then when he moves, there we go, the cube is now jumping. Let's maybe rotate that over a little bit more. All right, and then I'm going to move over to maybe 106, and I'll rotate that over and bring it down. And you can just press period on the numpad to zoom over to the cube and just stick it right there. So it's just going onto the ground there. Maybe rotate that over, stick it into place right there. All right, so let's press 5 on the numpad. That'll take us out of the orthographic view, and let's see how that's looking. So again, it kind of looks like I made the cube go too far forward. So I'm gonna just go back here to this perspective. Let's press 5 again on the numpad to go to the orthographic view and see how that's looking. So yeah, the cube kind of goes a little bit too far forward. So I'm gonna go back to frame 100 where this keyframe is, and I can just press G to grab and move that back a little bit. So now that's looking much better. And then also at the end here, he's probably going to fall just a little bit faster than how much he comes up. So I'll just press G to grab, and we're just going to stick that there. And there we go, so he lands. Now, if you look at that from the perspective, I'm just gonna press 5 on the numpad to go back to the perspective view. So if I now just play through this, you can see that something looks a little bit off. He kind of just stops immediately, and it would make sense that the cube would just slide a little bit because he has all that momentum. So I'm just gonna go to frame 110, and I can press 7 on the numpad to go to the front view. I can now press G to grab, and I'm just gonna bring this over just a little to about there. And then you can see now if I play this, the cube just kind of slides over. So the cube jumps and then just kind of slides at the very end there, and it just makes it look a bit more natural and realistic. All right, that's really good. So I'm now just going to select this keyframe right here, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and let's bring it out. So now the cube can just kind of stay in place for just a little while, maybe a second or so. And now I want the cube to jump really big and kind of jump up onto this platform. So I'm going to now move to frame maybe 35, and let me just press 5 again to go to the orthographic view so I can kind of see that without the perspective. And I'll press G to grab and R to rotate. Let's kind of bring that up there. All right, so he kind of jumps up. Let's move over to maybe frame 145, and I'll rotate this and bring it down right there. Just kind of bring that over so he's kind of on the ledge there. All right, I can also rotate that over if I need to, and just make sure the cube is level with the ground. All right, so now we can just play through that and see how that's looking. So that does look pretty good, although it is a little bit slow. And also something weird happens here. You can kind of see that the cube kind of rotates up a little bit, and I don't really want that. So let's first change the timing of the animation. So I'm going to click on this keyframe right here when the cube has moved up, and I'm just going to press G to grab and move it back a little bit. So we can now play through this and see how fast I want that to be. Probably about that. And then right here, he kind of moves really slowly. So I'm going to select this last keyframe, and I'll press G to grab, and we're going to bring that over there. So I need to bring it a little bit closer. That's looking better. And I think the cube could be a little bit more over this way. So I'm going to press 7 to go to top view. I want to move the cube down a little bit. So I'll just press G to grab, move that down a little bit. And then right here, move that over just a little, so that he's a little bit more straight. All right, so that's looking pretty cool. Now at the end here, I want him to kind of slide just like he did the other ones. So I'm just gonna move over to maybe frame 145, and let's press 7 to go to top view. And I can press G to grab, and we're just going to move that over a little bit. So now if we play that, you can see he jumps, and then when he lands, he kind of just slides over. So there we go. That's looking very good. Now you can see there's a little subtle thing here. If I play this, you can see the cube kind of flips upwards right here. You can look at this corner. The cube kind of flips upwards and then comes back down. You can see that's a little bit funky. So how I'm going to fix this is I'm going to move to this keyframe right here when the cube is all the way up. And then I'm also going to press 5 on the numpad to make sure I'm in the orthographic perspective. You can see right there it says orthographic. So what I want to do is actually rotate it over so it's more rotated over to its ending position. So I'll just press R to rotate that over. And if I play that now, you can see that looks much better, and it doesn't have that little wobble there at the very end. The wobble is now gone, and that's looking much better. All right, and then just like the other animations, I want to make him kind of slide along. So I'm going to press 7 to go to the top view, and I'm going to select the cube, and I'm just going to move over on the timeline to about frame 145. I can press G to grab. We're just going to move this over a little bit. So now if I play through this, you can see that he kind of jumps, and then he kind of slides over a little bit, and that just makes it look much more realistic. And then I'm going to select the last keyframe, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate. Let's bring it over so that he just kind of doesn't move for a little while. And then I want to make him kind of look around again. So I'm going to go to about frame 70, and then I can rotate this. So I'll rotate it on the Z-axis, just kind of have him look over. And so there we go. Now the cube looks over, and then I'm just going to select this keyframe here, and I'll press Shift D again to duplicate that. Just kind of move that over. So now the cube just stays where he is. And then I'll go to frame 205, and I can rotate this on the Z-axis. So R to rotate, Z to rotate it on the Z-axis, and I'll just have him look over like that. All right, and there we have it. So that's going to be it for the animation, a pretty simple animation. So we can just go back here and let's play the animation. So he kind of jumps over, looks around, jumps over, and then jumps on this platform here, and then he just kind of looks around. Now the animation ends at about 215. The animation is just going to end right about here. That's where I'm going to end my animation. So on the end frame right here, I can just click on this, and then I can type in 215 for 215. So now the animation ends at frame 215, and then if you keep playing it, it's just going to go back to the start frame. So let's now add a camera and just do a little bit of camera animation. So I'm going to press Shift A, and I'm going to go right down here to the camera. Let's just select the camera. And remember, the auto key is still on, so if you want to turn it off, you can turn it off. I'm going to leave it on and do some animating with the camera. So I want the camera to be kind of about here. So I'm going to move my view to about here, and then I'm going to press Control-Alt Numpad 0. That is going to hop the camera to where we are. And then I'm going to go to frame 1, and I want the camera to be right here. So I can press G to grab, and I'm just going to move it up and then stick it right there. I can also press G to grab and then double tap the Z key and just kind of bring the camera out a little bit. And you can see it's added a keyframe right there. So now I want to move the camera over to the end, which is 215. I'll press G to grab and G to grab. We're going to bring this out on the Z axis. So you can press G to grab and then double tap the Z key. Just kind of bring that out, and maybe also rotate this a little bit. So I'm going to press R to rotate. Let's rotate the camera on the Z axis and then just bring that over. Now the camera kind of slows down at the end. You can see it kind of gets quite slow at the end, and I don't want that. So what I want to do is change the keyframe interpolation of the camera so that it's very smooth and it doesn't change the speed. So what I'm going to do is press the A key in the timeline to make sure both of the keyframes are selected on the camera. And then to change the keyframe interpolation, you're going to press the T key with your mouse hovered over that, and then you're going to click on linear. So now if I play through the animation, you can see that the camera is just moving and it's not actually changing the speed. Now you can see that the camera still isn't really fast enough, so I can just override this keyframe. So I'm going to go to frame 115 and I can press G to grab. We can just move this over, and I can also move it back a little bit, and that's going to override that. And now let's just play through this. And you can see that is looking much better. And there we have it. So there is the basic animation. Now this tutorial is mostly just focused on animation, so I'm just going to skip ahead when I've set up some basic materials and done a few more things to make the 3D scene look kind of nice. All right, and I'm back. So I just added some different lights and some different cool materials to make this little like cubic world, and then there's like this red cube and he's kind of hopping around the world. And as I said earlier, if you want to download the project files, I will have a free download available on my Gumroad and Patreon with the links in the description if you'd like to download this file here. So now I'm going to show you how to turn your animation into a video file. So what I recommend doing is rendering out all your frames to an image sequence, and then in Blender's video editor you can compile them together into your finished video. And I recommend that because if you're rendering this and something goes wrong with the animation, if you're rendering it to a video and you have to cancel the video or something is wrong, you're going to have to re-render all the frames. But if you render it out to an image sequence, you can just throw it into Blender's video editor, and then you can add music and sound effects and do some things to the video and then just export it real quick to a video file. So I would definitely recommend rendering these out to an image sequence. So what I'm going to do is right here on the file format, I'm going to set it to JPEG images because JPEGs are a smaller file size, and then I can click on this button right here to set an output. And then on my computer, I just made a folder called frames, and I'm just going to click on the accept button so it'll render out all of the frames to images in that folder. And then I'll just click on file and save this project again. And then to render the animation, you can press Ctrl F12 or click on render and then render animation. All right, and the animation finished. So we're now just going to throw this into Blender's video editor and export it to a video. So I'm going to click on file and I'm going to click on new. And let's just go down here to a video editing, and it's going to open up the video editing layout. So right down here in the timeline, I'm going to press Shift A, and let's go down here and add the image sequence. And then you're just going to locate to the folder where you have saved all of the frames. So I'm just going to press A to select everything. That'll just select all the frames, and then you can click on add image strip. Now what's really important is to make sure that the frame rate and the resolution is the same that you rendered it. So you can just go back to your other Blender file and check what the resolution was. A really easy way to set the resolution though is to just select this strip and then click on strip, and then you can go right down here to set render size. And now it's going to set the render size to what I rendered it as. So I rendered it as a 2K resolution video. So if you want to add sound effects or music, you could do that just by adding it in here. I do need to set the end frame though. So the end frame, my end frame was 215 frames. So on the end frame right here in the corner, I'm going to set this to 215, and now that's going to set the end frame. Now let's scroll down here and we can do the render settings. So I need to set an output, so I'm going to click on this button right here, and I'm just going to save this as final video in a folder on my computer, and I'll just click on accept. Now for the file format, I like to use use the FFmpeg video. I think that works great. And then on the encoding, I like to use MPEG-4, and on the video codec, I like to use H.264, and I just leave this at medium quality and good. And then if you have any audio, you could set the audio. So I'm going to change it to no audio, but if you are using some audio, then I like to use an audio codec of AAC. So you can just save this project, and then you can click on render, and then you can render the final animation. And there we have it. So there is the finished animation. So that is going to wrap it up for this tutorial on how to do animation in Blender for beginners. So thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I really hope this was helpful, and I hope you learned a lot from this tutorial. And if you'd like to download the free project files, I'll have the links in the description where you can download the free project files on my Gumroad store and also my Patreon page. And if you'd like to help support me and my YouTube channel, I am trying to create Blender content and Blender tutorials for a living. So if you'd like to check out my Gumroad and Patreon, you can get 3D models and assets, you can get the procedural materials that I create, you can also get the tutorial files for my tutorials and exclusive tutorials as well. So checking out my Gumroad store and Patreon page is a really great way to help support me and my YouTube channel. So that's going to wrap it up for this video, so I hope this was helpful, and thank you for watching.